All right, so we are live. Thanks for joining us here with Ray Orsini. And if somehow you already don't know who Ray is, why don't you just do a little intro?
What's up, everybody? Ray Orsini, CEO and founder of both OIT VoIP partner for MSPs, and MSP Media Network, where we put together a whole lot of shows and great content exactly like this for the MSP News Channel.
All right, and may not know who I am, Matt Topper with ConnectWise, formerly with Iconic IT, Integris, Capstone, and Gradient MSP. Uh, we are here to talk about not 3CX. I'm sure that's been talked about to death by this point. We don't want to be yet another voice talking about that. But to talk about the idea of planning for things like the next 3CX, and I don't necessarily even mean just in the case of the next big vuln, the next big breach, but the value of having a plan and knowing what to do rather than on the fly hearing about this big infosec headline and everybody kind of wondering what to do, or maybe even worse, having five people decide that they're in charge and nobody really knowing what to do next or how to do that or who talks to clients or what happens afterwards. Um, so we called this at Iconic, and I just want to plug. I don't know if he watches my content anymore, but Tony Miller came up with the name. We called it the imminent risk policy, and we decided that that would be our way to coordinate what happens when these things come out. This came out after Log4j, when the 3CX thing came out, all that kind of stuff. So let me start with this. I do want to go through what we had as the policy, but Ray, we were talking pre-show about how you guys handle this, and I think it's kind of similar. Why don't you take us through briefly um, what you guys do when you have that kind of thing come up?
Yeah, so we refer to them as major incidents, and I can't take credit for this. I stole this from when I worked for the police department for 10 years. But we'd always have a declaration of major incident, and that your qualifying parameters for that could be damn near everything. I mean, you discuss internally, but the idea is you have the parameters to declare a major incident, and then you assign the roles. The roles for us is four of them. There's incident commander, basically the person in charge of everything, the comms lead or communications lead, event lead. That person is responsible for diagnostic testing, ultimate resolution. Basically, they're the technical resource on that side, and then documentation lead. That person is keeping track of all the messages that go into that thread and pulling out the appropriate information so we can have our what's more commonly known as an RFO, reason for outage. We call them a major incident report. Because it's not just relegated to outages, right? Like, for the example, the 3CX thing, that wasn't an outage. That was
Right.
to eliminate the problem. You had to create a deficit of service for the client by removing the app, but it's not really an outage, right? It still deserves the same kind of attention. So with those four roles, we have assignments, and I'll get you an unbranded version of it if you want to share with your audience later. But yeah, it's basically a breakdown of how we handle things.
No, that would be awesome, and I will share that. I'll also share a sanitized copy of what we did as well. And so what I think we'll do is let's just go through. There were, just the 4 or 5 steps that we went through broadly, and let's just go through how we handled this and use that as a model for how this can be handled at other organizations, other MSPs, and this is how we did it, right? This is not me or Ray saying this is the way to handle this kind of incident. What the thing we're trying to really raise awareness of is to have a plan, and you can steal mine, you can still raise, but think about what you would do.
Yeah,
So
it's
for
you have so many of these things, right? It's not it's like the major incident parameters. It doesn't matter as long as you have a plan, right? The rest of it is you'll figure it out. But having a plan like solves 90% of the challenges up front, and then fix it later if you need to improve it.
exactly. So the first phase in this plan we called awareness, and the size of our organization by the time I left was relatively significant, and so we had, if something hit Reddit or something hit Twitter or something hit whatever, there might be 50 people who saw it, and one of those might not be me or anyone else on the infosec team. And so we said, okay, there needs to be a way for anyone in the organization to say, hey, I saw this, security team, investigate this. For us, the answer to that was a Teams channel that anyone could post to. Uh, let the infosec team know, create a ticket, whatever. After hours, cell phones published. How did you guys handle that? Was there somebody designated? Was there a place to uh, post it? What was the answer there?
So we have an announcement policy, and that comes back to the communications lead. The communications lead
Mhm.
is usually somebody from marketing or somebody from corporate comms that understands how to speak to a wider audience, right? Because technicians are really good at handling an individual client, no question. That's their jobs. But when you're talking to a wider audience, you need to start accounting for, besides the things you say, what are the questions they're going to come up with? How are they going to take the words you say? Are you going to scare them more by giving them what's going on? You know what I mean? So, and also how to plan for what's next, whatever the next
Right.
steps is, including when to expect the next communication. So one of the things our partners beat me up on really early on, and actually I kind of did the same with Amy Lucci, and she implemented it for ConnectWise. So I got to give her credit where credit's due. We have an announcement policy. So depending on things like if we're just initially investigating something, we don't have any details yet. We don't have enough to go to the broad audience and say this is going on. Those announcements will go straight to our Discord, so we can have real time communication, gather more information depending on who's having the challenges. But the idea is identifying your champions and stakeholders that you could use for preliminary testing. That's not going to affect the greater whole, right? You can't call the average client and say, I need your computer for 30 minutes to troubleshoot something that's happening to everybody. You're going to piss them off. But we all know a few clients that
Yeah.
would always be, that are always down to help, right?
The
That are
friendly
always like
ones.
the friendly ones. I refer to those as champions, and you want to identify those. For us, thankfully, it's a lot of MSPs, so we have those champions. The Discord is our place for it. But then, and that's during the, like you said, during the discovery phase. What is going on? The awareness of what's going on. That comms lead handles a lot of the initial data gathering, alongside the techs.
Mhm. No, that's exactly it. Um, and so for us, we had this collection, this almost, oh, hey Kelvin, this bucket of potential incidents, potential vulnerabilities, potential things that needed to be worried about that anyone in the organization could put info in and put input into. And the next step on that was someone on the security team, which meant me most of the time, or a couple other people in the org, had to vet these, right? Because we had the downside of anyone being able to put it in is that some of the things that we were alerted to as a team weren't really impactful or were things that could wait till the next patch cycle. A good example was not too long ago, there was a VMware vulnerability and an issue that needed to be fixed. If all of your VMware servers were segregated off into a management VLAN and didn't have internet access and things like that. So the next thing we did was said, okay, we have to, whoever first gets this from the infosec team, his job is to vet this issue. Is it real? Is it something that we have to move on to? Is it something that we have to take action on right now? If it happens to be 11 o'clock at night and we just got a text about this, what happens next? And if so, we moved on to the next phase of the plan, which was to have an internal infosec meeting. Um, Now, there's a lot of people who could be involved in this. If you're in a smaller org, it might just be one or two individuals. For us, it was, whoever was available out of maybe 5 or 6 people. You guys all got on a Teams call or a conference call or whatever, and we evaluated the exposure. Right. So, what kind of exposure do we have? Do we have clients who have this technology? Right? Did we get notified of a Linux thing and we don't have any Linux machines under management? Was it a Mac thing? No Mac machines under management. And we said, okay, what impact, what type of exposure does this have? Is this something we have to worry about? Based on that, there were a couple things we could do. One, obviously, there might be nothing. If there was nothing, case closed, moved on. If it was something that we had exposure to, then it was a real significant thing. And the next thing we did was determine remediation. And so I'm going to stop talking for a second, Ray, and let you talk again. Determined remediation really is just thinking about what to do next. And how would you guys go about that when you saw something like the 3CX or some kind of notable vuln or something else going on?
So we'd look at it from from the perspective of who's affected, right? Um, is sometimes the medicine more damaging than the disease? For cases like, and this could be applied to anything. We're just using 3CX since it's the most recent.
Mhm.
But the methodology is true overall. Is we were talking about, well, if you're going to delete the desk phone app, right, the Windows and Mac desk phone app, you are absolutely going to affect those people using the app, and you know that's not 100% of your client base, but find a way to determine who those are most, who's going to be affected by it, who's using the calls at that time, or who's logged into the app, so you can determine not only the remediation part of it, but also making sure those people are informed of the of the workarounds, right? The PWA app or whatever it happens to be. If you're going to take away some kind of service from the client or whoever it happens to be, you need to be prepared with a workaround or an alternate solution, and the communications to go along with it, and the method for making sure they get those communications,
Right.
right? If you tree falls in the forest, no one's there to hear it. Did you really have an incident response? Whatever. But something along those lines. So
Right.
that
And
that's to me the hardest part, right? Like determining who you need to reach out to make sure they're taken care of.
for sure. And the reason for us, at least, that we broke out determined remediation into a separate step is that, especially early on in some of these events, you're really not sure what to do or what needs to happen. In some cases, like in 3CX, the only real remediation at the time was to uninstall the application. In some cases, there's some uncertainty around, is there a patch? Does the patch work? Like when the exchange stuff happened about a year ago, there was some IAS rules that you might have to apply that may or may not have been effective depending on who you asked. In some cases, there's a patch that needs to be applied. In some cases, you have to close a port. In some cases, the only option is to completely block off the service. So thinking about what needs to do or what can happen, and that's a an input for the next step. Um, have a plan, know what needs to happen or what your options even are for remediation, and to what degree you can automate them to think about what happens next. And for us, the next step in this whole process was, with that information, with that remediation stuff determined, we reached the decision point. And this decision point is kind of the crux of the whole process, and it's so important that we called it out into its own step. And again, I'll post a sanitized version of this later. It'll be much clearer than my verbal explanation of it. um, Basically, the next step in the process is, you have a real vulnerability, a real issue. You know that you have a remediation. It may be disruptive. That may be the only option. You need to decide as an organization, does this event, is that significant enough to warrant whatever the remediation is? So what we were just talking about for 3CX, is whatever is happening impactful enough, and do you have enough exposure in your client base to pull everybody's soft phone application out? If the exchange issue, do you have enough of an issue to remove everyone's mail flow, to reboot everyone's exchange server, to cut off everyone's RDS server, whatever, right in the middle of the day? And so a lot of the paperwork and bureaucracy around this policy was, who makes that call? Um, so, Ray, how do you guys handle that? Who makes that decision once you have all this information about whether or not to do something disruptive to the client?
That falls on the incident commander for us. That's the person that's determining scope, resolution, impact. They're the ones making the final, and obviously that's always a senior. That's probably the most senior resource of the
Mhm.
four that are working any kind of incident. Um, but the incident commander, and they're empowered to make those decisions, good, bad, or otherwise. And that has to come straight from ownership and leadership, saying, hey, if we're going to have this person take all the responsibility, we're going to support them 100% on their decisions, including you are going to have some pissed off customers. There's no way around it. Uh, it's just part of the game, but you have to support that person. um having been in real life or death situations, in person, it's not fun. And
Right.
any decision you make can is wrong in somebody's eyes. So you just have to go for what's the highest good, right? And that's kind of the hard thing too, right? Do you cut off the leg to save the human, or do you, shut down the RDS server, bringing them down for a couple hours while you go through and find your point of egress, or your impact point. Those are hard decisions to make, but you need somebody that has ice in their veins, that is capable of making that, in combination with understanding the needs of the client, right? It's goes back to, we none of us appreciated this, but what was it, 6-7 years ago, the Sony thing, where they knew their security was lacking, but they said the cost of remediation and insurance payouts was cheaper than the cost of getting the security up to par, and that was a conscious decision. Hopefully not a decision anybody watching this will ever agree with, but it is a business decision at the end of the day, and that's why that incident commander can't just be a technical role. They should be somebody in the executive space, or somebody in the leadership space that understands the other ramifications, not just the technical ones.
Agreed. That's a really good point. But what we did was list out a hierarchy of positions within the organization who were authorized to make that call, and it started at the exec level and got down to um, not every tech, but there were a few like technical management people who were authorized to make that call. And we kind of just said, okay, it might be 2 a.m. when this is going on. Whoever the most senior person on this list who happens to be around makes the decision, and we all own the outcome as a group.
Yeah.
One thing that can really help with that is you don't necessarily have to document and have a very complex flow chart, but right in whatever policy document you have around this, list out some of the objectives and some of the key points you would take into account when deciding whether to do this, some guidelines to help you make that decision and make it less objective, or make it less subjective, make it more empirical, as far as based on what we're seeing, this applies. Now don't, right, obviously don't become a slave to the procedure. That's not good for anyone either. But it helps everyone to have some justification, especially if you fall into one of those cases where it really is, middle of the night, you have the lowest guy that you've authorized to make that decision making the call, and you want to make it easier for them to justify themselves. That's what we did. It seemed to help. Luckily, it didn't come up very often, mostly because I was always up at 2 a.m.
Yeah, we've all been there, man. We've all been there.
Right.
The phone goes off and you're like, ah. I mean, to this day, even though I don't do much of any of the technical stuff anymore unless I'm helping out, I still can't leave my house without a laptop in the car. Like, I can't
Right.
get out of that
Right.
mentality, you know?
No, I do. I do. You see me walking around conferences like it's my laptop bag, thinking, what am I actually going to fix if something comes up? Nothing at
Yeah.
this point.
It doesn't stop me. Every conference, well, you see me carrying around the
Yeah.
backpack or the
Yeah.
laptop bag, and I'm like, I don't even take it out. Like, there's no reason for me to carry this thing around. But that mentality of that 2 a.m. call, or you're out on the street and suddenly that server starts giving 500 errors, and you're like, I need to go log in and see what's going on, even if other people are handling it. You just, that need to be prepared,
I do. I do. That's what it's all about. Um, so up until this point in the procedure, the only communication that has happened for us, at least, is internal. The only message has been to that Teams channel where everyone posts the "Hey, we saw something," has been a message from InfoSec that said, "We're looking at this. Please stop spamming us with it." Um, Nothing has gone out to clients yet at this point, and the reason for that, from our perspective, is that we don't want really anything going out to clients until we've had that meeting with the infosec team, thinking what needs to happen, and we've decided to actually do something. And the reason for that will be evident when we get to the last step. um, what we decided to do is we don't necessarily want our engineers writing the message that goes out to all clients. So we broke this into two parts. We have, as an output from that meeting with whoever is around from the security team, a technical summary comes up, 1 to 2 paragraphs that account managers or someone else who is better at communicating with customers can insert right into the email that they send to clients. We want our techs doing technical work. We want our account managers and VCIOs talking to clients. Um, how do you guys handle that? Is there a dedicated comms person? Do you update the website? Yeah, it's a little bit of a different case, I know, than an MSP. But what does it look like?
Yeah, a lot of it is honestly very similar to how we handled as MSP. So the event lead, that technical resource, is doing exactly what you said, that technical summary of what's going on, going over the documentation lead to put it all in the same place. Um, that way, the event lead can be messy, throwing as much data in there as necessary.
Hmm.
So you have the whole picture. The documentation lead's the one that's taking that out and saying, okay, this is the stuff we really care about when it comes to RFO, major incident report, communicating with clients, filtering it down, right? Um, then the comms lead will go and look at that and determine when do we start sending messages. They'll craft the message. Um, the comms lead will put it out over our social media if it warrants that according to our announcement policy. They'll put it out on Discord. If it needs to go to like our status page, right, or and the RSS feeds and the alerts that go there, they'll draft the message that actually goes there. When it comes to the tickets and stuff like that, if we've had tickets already coming in from clients, the initial go-to is we've received a report, we're looking into it, we will get back to you as soon as possible. But like you said, not giving a whole lot of information because you don't want to give the wrong thing. You don't want to misspeak. You don't want to make it worse, which is entirely possible when these things are going on. The comms lead will draft the final message, update all the tickets so the subject line's the same on all of them, so we can filter by it easily. And they'll put in the message that'll go out to the clients. This is what's going on. We're aware of this. We're going to be updating here, status at oatvoip.com, whatever it happens to be, or monitor, sign up for updates, or we'll update you on the case, whatever the message is.
Right.
But always that comms lead is sending those messages. Um, I want everybody to do what they're best at. And at the end of the day, the comms lead is best at communications. My event lead is best at tech. Let the techs be the best at what they do. Um, nobody feels like they're at the deep end of the pool. It's already hard enough, right? Make it easier on them.
No, I agreed. I mean, the last thing that you want, and this isn't to say anything negative about techs or engineers. I'm one too. Um, I am not the right person, or at least when I was doing engineering work primarily, was not the right person to be having the conversation with the end customer. Um, in later roles, I became that, and when I was an engineer, that's not the case. We want our communications guys doing comms, our tech guys doing tech. Agree 100%. And one of the reasons for that is, like we were just talking about, when the decision is made to take action, we will decide to do things like reboot the Exchange server out of band, or cut off RDS, or cut off software phones, or whatever the case may be. Um, if something is deemed serious enough to start doing that, uh, we just do it, right? We're not waiting for the comps to go out and be acknowledged necessarily. If we can, we will. But if it's serious enough that there are threat actors taking advantage of that vuln right then and there, we're not waiting, right? We're sending out the comms almost as an
Yeah.
explanation for here's why your stuff just went down, not your stuff is going to go down. And it allows us to do two things simultaneously. It allows the tech guys to start working the actual problem remediation. Hopefully, it's just a patch and it's real quick. But if
Mhm.
things have to go down, then things have to go down. And part of that in communication is making sure that we have alternate communication methods aside from email around to get the clients, right? We were just talking
Oh yeah.
about when Exchange just happened. The last thing we need to be doing is sending an email out. We're about to kill your Exchange server, which I have seen happen.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so do not wait for comms to go out. And one of the things that we put in with that is put an actual time limit on the time spent being able to do automation, right? So once you get to a big enough issue or big enough event, or let's say it's a Windows thing, and you can't just go find your 10 on-prem Exchange servers that are left, hopefully less than 10, but however many on-prem Exchange servers you have, and you have to go do something on 5, 10,000 Windows devices.
Hmm.
There's a time to write the automation, and there are some
Oh yeah.
guidelines in the policy about how much time do you spend on that before you start logging into things. Um,
Well, and remediation changes, right? Like your
right.
remediation today may not be the remediation 2 hours later. how many times, going back to 3CX, how many times did that change? Log4j, how many times did that change? Print Nightmare, that went on forever. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so,
Months.
like you say, there has to be someone to determine how long are we going to spend automating this? What is the appropriate course of action? The goal, if you're a larger MSP and you have multiple resources, especially when you can assign different people to do these different roles, you get the benefit of they can happen in tandem. So you can always
Yes.
take an engineer and say, so I'm a big proponent of have somebody on staff that does DevOps. Like that is their job, automation 100% of the day. Put that person on scripting the automation, but get some text on it immediately, start remediating by hand. You know what I mean? At some point, the tool will catch up and then put it across the rest of the devices. But you don't want to, like you said, sometimes there's imminent threats where you can't wait for a comms package. You can't wait for
Right.
a bunch of alerting to go out. You have to start remediating immediately. Um, Within reason, of course. You know what I mean? Like, don't start wiping the whole hard drive because you got one phishing alert. But
Yeah.
hopefully with enough leadership, enough, senior leadership in that incident command or whoever's overseeing everything, they'll have the right judgment to determine the best course of action.
Yeah, and in some cases, the action is not to do anything. In some cases, the answer to one of the original questions was, well, we don't actually know how much exposure there is. We need to go find out who has Log4j installed or who has, whatever installed. There are some cases with 3CX and Exchange where your VCIOs, your account managers, will know immediately how much exposure you have, and some where there's some investigative work to do, and that might be part of the remediation, right? The remediation doesn't necessarily only mean going to uninstall things and installing patches. It could mean, okay, we're going to dedicate an hour to go find out how much exposure we have.
Yeah. I mean, that's the tough thing, right? Clients want to know why it happened, and remediating is more important than why, for most events. I don't want to say all events. Um, and I'm not saying they're both not equally important. I'm saying as far as getting it done right now, they're not equally urgent, right?
Right.
Remediation is more urgent than determining the source. Um, and if you have to go back and change, you go back and change. But you can save yourself a lot of headache. I've always been a big proponent of setting expectations up front. When you're signing your client, you're telling them we're going to run business a certain way. When you're having your VCIO meetings, your QBRs, your whatever, hopefully you're going over your DRAS plans, and you're saying, okay, well, in a disaster scenario, in an incident scenario, these are the things that have to be up no matter what. I don't care if I have to sacrifice a baby goat, it has to stay up. And these are the things that they're really going to hurt, and it costs us X amount per hour to be down, but we know it can happen. And just these are the processes for that. So you're not waiting for that when something goes wrong. Now, if you didn't plan for any of that, and I know I know there's plenty of resources out there how to handle an incident response. Do it ahead of time. Don't sit there and wait for it to happen.
Yeah.
Don't wait for the boom, right?
Exactly. Right. That's the whole theme here. Don't try and figure all this stuff out on the fly. And it's worth simulating at least a couple times if you haven't. All right. So
Yeah, good old
last thing
tabletop.
in our plan, and then we can talk about. I already see one question up. We'll answer that in a minute too. The last thing that we had, actually, I want to make one more point. You mentioned something, Ray, about different roles and the advantage of having a larger MSP in doing this. One thing to note, though, is that this type of planning isn't only applicable to large organizations. When you're a smaller org, right? And we did similar things when we were a smaller org as well. It's just that some of the same people wore different hats, but all of these roles need to happen independently of each other, right?
For sure.
Each of these things needs to happen. It's just that you might be stuck doing all of them if you're smaller.
Well, how many clients did you walk in to pitch MSP services and they said, we don't have an IT person? And my answer would be, do you have a janitor? And they're like, no. I go, do you take out the trash? They're like, yeah, I do it. Congrats. You're the janitor. You have an IT person. It's just you're not paying somebody for it. It's the same thing here. If you're a smaller org, you might be wearing all the hats. It doesn't take away from the need for those roles to be filled.
Right.
And it's so easy to get caught up in the chaos. There's a Navy SEALs saying, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. When all this stuff is falling on your shoulders and you're panicking, it's very easy to start skipping steps just for the sake of expediency. And in my opinion, that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make. If you have a plan, stick to the plan with good judgment. But don't start skipping stuff just to save time. It doesn't save anybody.
With experience, you will know at what point to crumple up the plan and start winging it. And most of the time, that is the wrong call. And you just don't realize that at the time. But usually, sticking to the plan is the right move. You made the plan for a reason.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So the last thing we did, and we'll get to questions if we have any after this, is once this is all done and you've gone through the remediation and you've addressed whatever needs to be addressed, the last thing is the what we called the more professional communication went out. And this is when we actually had the marketing team spend some time putting together and thinking about how to phrase it. Again, with input from the technical team, right? The final
Yeah.
summary of what came up and what we did and what needs to happen now. And there's two reasons for that. One is simply the reassurance that when they see something, this hits the big news sites, right? The non-tech ones that someone might read, that they know ahead of time. Oh, I got an email that this has already been taken care of. We're good to go. And the other thing is really show value. I mean, there's legitimate value in your if you are spending your whole night worrying about some potential remediation and potential vulnerability that came up, you should, for lack of a better word, get credit for that with your client base, right? You need to be
Oh yeah.
showing that you're taking care of that, not just silently fixing it. And that's where um, someone who's qualified in PR and qualified in marketing can take that and make it sound way better than I could as a tech and as an engineer, and show and demonstrate that value. It really, there's huge benefits to doing that. Your clients should know that you're helping them.
Oh, 100%. I mean, at the end of the day, clients will appreciate communication more than they'll be mad about downtime.
Mm,
As long as you're telling them, what you're doing, what's going on, what to expect next. That's the worst. We'll let you know when we know something, and then you don't know if that's 2 hours or 24 hours. And if client's down, that's every second they're counting. I guarantee you. Um, and those are the things that, like, and that's why we have our little prepackaged messages. But I'm with you. The final message, the one that's actually the post-mortem, and that's where the documentation lead comes in handy, because they're noting appropriate, important things from the chain of events, right? Like first notice of incidents and how many people were affected and what we did this and when we did that, blah blah, the chain of events. But that makes the basis for that final. And you're right, it looks more like a press release or a marketing send than it does look like a technical document. Because again, look at your audience, right? If you're talking to clients, you want them to read in a way that it'll answer their questions. They know you're available should you need more. The last thing you want to do is be explaining a bunch of acronyms that they have no idea what's going on, because unknown equals fear to a client that's
right.
already been burnt. So answer as much as you can in advance in a way that's easy for him.
If somebody wants to talk acronyms and tech, they are welcome to call and have a meeting about it. Most of the recipients don't want to hear about
Yep, 100%.
it. Okay, so last thing, we're already over time. We had one question in the Q&A, and I'll just post it. And the question was, how do you decide the time limit to switch from tinkering to fix versus just restoring functionality? So at what point do you just say, forget it, I'm going to restore from backups, is how I'm taking this during an outage or IR type of event. And for me, um, that comes down to an impact analysis. Without being too formal, it really would kind of be like the output of a BIA if you're like a very formal process driven organization. But if you're not, like I wasn't for a very long time, um, how severe is what's going on? How disruptive is this to the business? Is this a manufacturing company that can't produce any widgets at all? Or is this a shipping company that can't ship any products? Or what kind of impact is that? And this is largely a non-technical issue. You need input from your primary contact of the client to make this decision. How painful is it for them? And how much time do they want you to spend on this kind of thing before you say forget it and let me do a restore? And you can make a suggestion. You might have an intuition as an engineer and your knowledge is working with the customer and the organization of how disruptive this is. But ultimately, this is a case where it really needs to be a joint decision between you and a specific customer about how disruptive this is. Is that kind of what you would say, Ray? Do you have a different
Yeah.
mechanism?
Yeah. I think you're right. We're on the same page when it comes to that. I'll give a real world example, right? So in the VoIP world, toll fraud is a major thing. It's a common thing.
Mhm.
It's something we all have to watch out for. But it goes back to creating those impact response plans or incident response plans ahead of time. We have knock contacts for all of our partners that we get from day one, and we check on that every year. We update the knock contacts, and we ask them in the event of a fraud incident, do you want us to take action? Do you want us to cut off calls, or do you want us to just notify you and let it roll? Um, and that's a very finite example of that. But the idea is getting the understanding of the kind of pain the client is willing to endure, right? How much downtime can they really have? Can they really afford to have? You should know that in advance. And yes, have a way. Don't start trying to figure out who's impacted, like who to talk to at the client to get these answers when it's going on. That'll drive you nuts on its own. You
Yeah.
need that contact identified in advance. But when you can do that, you know, yes, it's a business person, it's an account manager, it's a leadership or a manager role, that understands the business case, that either has already prepared for this in advance or talks to the client in plain language and say, we need to do this, it's going to hurt, but it's your benefit because of XYZ reasons. So I hate saying it's case by case and it depends. I really hate those answers. um, but it depends on the
Consultant answer.
conversation you've had with your client, better
Yeah.
said.
And if you're talking about the case of a specific vulnerability that you're working through according to an imminent risk response policy, then the reality is you just have to make some assumptions about your client base. Do you specialize in a particular vertical? Is there something unique? What time of day is it? What type of service is it? If we're talking in one of the examples, remote access, it's a different conversation about remote access at 2 in the morning than 2 in the afternoon. Just take those variables into account, and there isn't going to be a real right answer. There's not a flow chart for that necessarily. There's a take in all the variables and as much information as you have available to you at the time. And there's a reason that you trusted the people on that plan to make a call. You just have to make one.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, we are already over time, so we can wrap it up and let everyone get back to your day. So thanks very much for watching, and we will post our promised deliverables, the sanitized versions of these policies, later today or tomorrow. Thanks, guys.
Sounds good. Thanks, man.